Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our conversation with the patriotic philanthropist, David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you.
The best way to introduce this conversation, which I've been so looking forward to, is to describe the encounter you just had where one of your colleagues came up and said, "Thank you, David Rubenstein, for having allowed my kids to see the Washington Monument, Monticello, Montpelier, and helping them understand the connection between history and American values. You've helped make them better Americans." So thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to do this. I know you're a pretty busy guy, so thanks for coming down. I know it's a hardship to be in Palm Beach, but I appreciate it.
Well, it is a hardship because you promised me a ride here, and I had to get here on my own, so it was very, very tough.
Next time.
Okay, good. Let's begin with the obvious question. How did you become interested in patriotic philanthropy?
Okay, let me try to, when I'm interviewing people, I like short answers, but I'm not going to give you a short answer.
Okay.
It takes long. So let me try to explain. Essentially, I came from very modest background, maybe like many of you, blue-collar background. My parents did not graduate from college or high school. I was their only child. I grew up in Baltimore. I wanted to be in government, public service, inspired by President Kennedy about serving the country, as you may remember from his inaugural address. So I decided to do that. I wasn't that good at it. I wasn't that great a lawyer. The law firms kind of pushed me out. I went to work for the White House for President Carter. I got inflation to 19%, so the voters pushed us out. So it was, so I wasn't good as a lawyer. I wasn't good in public policy. And so I got lucky. I started a private equity firm, and it became one of the largest in the world. And then I realized that I had a great deal of money. And then when you have a great deal of money, you can do one of a few things with it. You can buy a lot of homes and art and yachts and planes. And at some point, you realize, you can't really be buried with this stuff, though the ancient pharaohs thought you could be, and they were buried with their wealth. But there's no evidence that you really need all this in the afterlife. So I decided to eliminate that as a possibility. The second is you can do what most people over the history of the world have done with their wealth, which is to pass it to their children. And I did not think that giving each of my children $1 billion would necessarily make them a better human being. Now, they may not have agreed with that, but I thought that, how many people won a Nobel Prize inheriting $1 billion after they've inherited it? That usually you're not as motivated. So I said, I'm not giving them large amounts of money. So then the next thing you can do is you can say you're going to give it away to good causes, and most people who don't give it away to their children give it to good causes upon their death. And for whatever reason, many people don't like to part with their money until they're gone. And I wasn't sure I would be somewhere where I could see what my executor was doing with the money. So I decided I would try to give it away while I was alive, and if I lived a normal actuarial life, I'd have some more time to do this. And then around that time, Bill Gates called me and he said, "Would you sign the Giving Pledge?" And there were about 40 of us who initially signed it, saying we give away half our money upon our death or during our lifetime. And I said, actually, I'm going to give away all my money. I'm in the process of doing that. And so like many people here, all of you care about philanthropy, presumably, or you wouldn't be here, you have many great things you can do. You can do it in education, healthcare, things related to scholarships. And most of my money for a long time was going to the typical place that had given me scholarships, had helped with my children in educating them, or healthcare, medical research, the things that many people do, and I wasn't all that unique. Something happened that changed my trajectory in philanthropy, and it got the intent that I gave it the title Patriotic Philanthropy, which I'll explain for a moment. And it came about through serendipity. Like most things in life that are great, you don't plan for them. It just happened in ways. Most of you may have met your spouse or partner by serendipity. That's the way life often works. You can't plan some of these things in advance. And so I'll tell you what happened, and then I began to do more in it. What happened was I was invited to go, and I'd worked as a young man at the White House, and so you have a sense of history, and I was always interested in history, but I can't say I was obsessive compulsive about it. I was invited to a viewing of something called the Magna Carta, and I was coming back from London, and I was reading my mail, and I saw that I was invited that night to go to New York to see the Magna Carta. And I said, wait a second, the Magna Carta is in London, that's where I just was. What's it doing in New York? And I figured maybe they shipped it over or something. Turns out when I got there that there are actually 17 copies of the Magna Carta, and 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, and 1 had been bought by Ross Perot in the early 1980s, and he had put it on display at the archives. He ultimately decided to sell it, and so it was going to go for sale that next night, and I was told it would go for sale to somebody who did not live in this country. They identified the likely countries that people would be the buyers from. And so I knew enough about American history to know that it had been the inspiration for our Declaration of Independence. All of our colonial charters more or less said, you have the rights of Englishmen, and that was taken to mean around the time of the Revolutionary War, the rights of the Magna Carta. No taxation without representation, for example. So I said, one of those should remain in the United States. There's 17, let's keep one in the United States. So I didn't want to tell my wife that she might say it's presumptuous to say I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. And I didn't want to tell my children, they might say, well, how much less money might this mean for us? So I just simply resolved to go back the next night, not tell anybody. I went there. I was not an art buyer at the time and didn't know Sotheby's. They put me in a little room and they started bidding. And if any of you have ever been in auctions, you know you get carried away. And eventually I started bidding and bidding and bidding. Then they said, sold. So I couldn't hear who won. And then they came in and said, you won. Who are you? We've never seen you before. And do you have the money for this, by the way? And yes. So they said there's 100 reporters there who want to know who bought it, or you can slip out the side door and take the Magna Carta with you once we get the money. And I said, actually, I don't mind talking to reporters. So I went out and said, look, I came from very modest circumstances. My father never made more than $7,000 or $8,000 a year. And in a country where my last name is a long Jewish ethnic name, that I could rise up and be able to afford something like this makes me feel that this country's been wonderful for me and my family. So I want to give this to the country as a down payment on my obligation to give back to the country for the good fortune I've had. So I'm going to put it. So I'm going to put it on the National Archives and as a permanent loan, and then when I die, it'll be there forever. And so I went to dinner right afterwards to see Chuck Prince, who was the CEO of Citicorp at the time, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm late for dinner. I just bought the Magna Carta. It took a little time. And he said, okay, sure. So next day, it was on the front page of the New York Times, and he called me and said, I'm sorry, nobody ever come to my house with an excuse like that before. They were late because they bought the Magna Carta. He didn't believe me at the time. So actually, now I started getting hundreds of emails from around the world. If you want to buy a Magna Carta for that price, I have one. So it turns out they're all fake. So I have this one, and that's the only one that's in the United States, the only one in private hands. And then I got interested in other buying historic documents. As you and I know, I bought a number of rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the Bill of Rights, and many of these historic documents. And in every case, my theory was not to put them in my home, but to put them on display at the National Constitution Center, at the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Mount Vernon, Montpelier, Monticello, places where people could see them. And the theory is simply this. The human brain has not yet evolved to the point where when you see something on a computer screen, it's exactly the same as seeing it in person. For the next, hopefully, 100 or maybe 1,000 years or 10,000 years, when you see something in person that's the original, you are more likely to be inspired by it. So if you see it, you know you're going to see the original Magna Carta, you're more likely to read about it in advance. If you have seen it, you're more likely to read about it afterwards. So rather than see what the Magna Carta looks like on the computer screen and just you forget about it, if you go visit one of these original documents, you might be inspired to learn more about it. And if you learn more about it, you'll know more about our history. And if you know more about our history, you're more likely to be a more informed citizen. I have a theory that the people who are more informed about our country and our citizenry are going to be better citizens, and we have better citizens, more informed citizens, we might have a better democracy. That's the theory behind it. And you and I have talked about this before, but my concern is that right now we don't teach civics very much anymore. We don't teach American history very much anymore in high school and junior high school. So you get amazing things like this. Right now, it is hard to believe, but an Annenberg survey recently showed that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. More than 1/3 of Americans cannot name a single right protected by the First Amendment. More than 80% of Americans cannot name a single justice of the United States Supreme Court, and 10% of college-educated people think that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court. So you get these amazing lacks of knowledge, and I just think we need to do more about it. And then what happened was the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage. I went to the head of the Park Service and said, look, Congress might take you a long time to get the money to fix it. I'll give you the money to fix it. And people seem to be very inspired by the idea that a private citizen would do that, and it didn't strike me as that unusual. But then I realized if people can come to the Washington Monument, they might be more inspired to learn more about Washington and so forth. And then I decided I would try to fix other things that might need fixing. So I went to Monticello to see what I could do to help that, or Montpelier to see what I could do to help that, or Arlington House at the top of Arlington Cemetery, or the Iwo Jima Memorial, or other historic buildings, and try to fix them on the theory that if more people visit them, by seeing a better experience, they'll learn more about American history. And the whole thing is designed to say, patriotic philanthropy is designed to preserve our American history and make sure people are more educated about it on the hope that they'll be more informed citizens. That's essentially what I'm trying to do. But I don't have the money to do all that I want to do, so I need a lot of other people to help doing it. Okay? Okay.
One of the remarkable aspects of your patriotic philanthropy is you not only loan historic documents, you help institutions teach about them. So I met David. I just started at the National Constitution Center. I've been on the job for about 2 weeks, and someone told me this guy is going to come and loan you the Declaration of Independence. Great, I thought. So, I knew you were very wealthy, but had never met you before. And we sat down, and I interviewed you about the relationship between the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And you were so riveting on that question, and were so able to explain the relation in clear terms, that we transcribed that conversation, and it's now the introduction to the National Constitution Center's Pocket Constitution, and it is online as part of our interactive constitution, and has now gone to 20 million Americans since it launched. So what I want you to do, because it's such a treat to hear you describe it for this great audience, is to tell them what is the relation between the Declaration of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and what are the basic principles you want all Americans to know about civics?
Remember, the Declaration of Independence was a propaganda document. What happened was we were getting ready at the second convention, Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress. We were getting ready to vote on a resolution by John Adams that we should separate from England. And in anticipation of the vote, the delegates had to go back to their states and get authority to vote. They didn't have it then. While they were away, a committee of 5 people was formed to prepare a statement that would explain, if we voted to be independent of England, what was the basis for it. And the document was to be written by a committee of 5 people. They were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And John Adams was the best known person there, and he was the leading advocate for getting to breaking away from England. But he felt he was so much of an advocate for that if he wrote the Declaration of Independence, it might make people think, well, of course, we know that's his view. So he wanted to have somebody from Virginia write it, because Virginia had not yet said they wanted to break away, and the young Thomas Jefferson, only 33 years old, was given the task. He was not an articulate person in many ways. As President of the United States, he only made one public speech. He had a high-pitched voice. He didn't like talking in public, but he was a very good writer, as we know from his 14,000 extant letters that we have. So he was given this assignment in 17 days to write it. In the 17 days, he did what most people did. He waited and did something else. So with 3 days to go, in his rented townhouse, with 2 slaves with him, he wrote out the Declaration of Independence. It had 3 parts. 1, the preamble, why we're doing this. 2, all the sins of King George, and they were a long list. And 3, what we're going to do about it, break away. After he wrote this, he gave it to his committee members, and they edited it a little bit. At the time, the only focus was really on the sins of King George, because that's why we were breaking away. And most of his Declaration of Independence had been devoted to the idea that King George had forced slavery on the United States. Since many of the people at the Continental Congress were slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson, they didn't really want to deal with that, so they cut all that out. And so they ultimately got a draft that was agreed to by the Continental Congress. And I would say the Continental Congress agreed to vote to be independent on July the 2nd. And at that time, John Adams wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail. We have about 1,000 letters between the two of them. And the letter said, July the 2nd will be the most famous day in our country's history. We will celebrate this with fireworks forever. Obviously, that didn't happen. But they took up on July the 2nd the draft of Thomas Jefferson, and they debated on the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th. And what was not paid attention to was the preamble. It was thought to be just verbiage. But it became the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that was not paid attention to a lot at the time. And ultimately, when the document was agreed to after much editing, and Thomas Jefferson was so upset with the editing, he refused for 8 years to acknowledge he was the author of it. And in fact, he sent letters to his friends saying, here's my version, here's what they did, don't you think my version's better? But he was just unhappy with what they did. Ultimately, it was printed up and so forth. The original printed version was called a Dunlop copy. A Dunlop copy means that Mr. Dunlop printed up 100 or so, about 100 of these broadsides. The whole text was on one side. Nobody had signed it yet. It wasn't actually signed until August, because in August they came back, they had to get the approval of New York State, which hadn't yet approved it, separating, and they also wanted to make sure they had it in gross copy and calligraphy so they could sign it. So, but they didn't want to wait until August for everybody to sign it, so they had a printed version without signatures printed the next day, and that was sent around to everybody. George Washington read it to the troops, King George got a copy, and so forth. There are now only about 25 of these left. A very famous one was bought by Norman Lear years ago. He was found in the back of a painting. And he bought it for $8 million. He took it around every state and showed him the birth certificate of the United States. It was sold not long ago, and it was sold in a private sale. And Norman Lear called me about something, and he said, by the way, were you the guy that bought it? I don't know who bought it. And he said, no, it wasn't offered to me. It was sold, though, for $25 million. And one day, not too long after, I was in the house of somebody, and I saw this perfect copy of the Dunlop Declaration of Independence, a brilliant copy, unmarked and everything. And I asked the owner, did you pay $25 million to buy this copy from Norman Lear? He said, no, I wouldn't spend that much on a document. Okay? He said, you sure? Yes. The next day, he sent me an email and said, I forgot, I did buy it. It was Bill Gates. He forgot. The reason the Declaration of Independence was largely ignored after it was printed. We said with the sins of King George, we fought the war. The war was over in 1781. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, and basically it was ignored for a while. But what happened in the latter part of the 1700s and the early part of the 1800s, and then really the middle of the 1800s, was that this preamble was taken by other countries to mean this is what government should be about, that all men are created equal and they have certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those words inspired people around the world. And actually, that sentence became the creed of our country. This was what the country is all about. And today, we have a belief, I think most Americans would have the view, that we're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all people are created equal. Not all men, but all men and all women, and all people are entitled to equal opportunity and so forth. That's more or less the creed of the country, and that's why the Declaration is so important. The Constitution is a whole nother set of issues, but the Declaration of Independence is not a legal document, just a propaganda document that has become a symbol of our country. The Constitution is the organic document that operates our government. And the Constitution was drafted with the idea that we'd have a stronger government than we had before under the Articles of Confederation. It did not initially embody these various principles because they were just trying to come up with a way to govern the country. When the Bill of Rights was added to it, it did more or less adopt some of the concepts embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And it's taken 100+ years to get the concept embodied in our legal system that, yes, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, everybody's equal, is now part of our country. But the relationship was the principles were set out in the Declaration of Independence, but they were not a binding document on anybody. And now our country is operated on the principles that were established initially in the Declaration, and then now the Constitution more or less operates in that way, though with its imperfections that we all know about.
Tell me and tell the group about how you think about your patriotic giving moving forward and how you and our friends can support civic knowledge.
The interesting thing about, and I'd like to say on philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. We've kind of bastardized the idea that philanthropy is just rich people writing checks. If the ancient Greeks thought that their equivalent of the word for philanthropy meant you're helping other people, you're loving humanity. And I try to tell all people that I talk to on this subject, you can love humanity by giving them something even more valuable than money, which is your time. You can always get more money, more or less, if you want to. You can't get more time. The most valuable thing you can get is time and give. And it's your ideas, your energy. And so very often I try to be involved in philanthropic ways by not just giving money, but giving my time, my energy, my ideas. And that I think is a valuable contribution, even though people really want the money, I suspect. But I try to tell people that I don't really have enough money and time or energy to do this, obviously, by myself. So I'm trying to get other people to do the same kind of things. An interesting thing is this. If sometimes I've given large amounts of money, $50 million or more to some project or something like that, and I'm not saying it needs an enormous amount of publicity, but it doesn't get that much because it's medical research or education. Because it's so common. People are today giving, writing billion-dollar checks for educational institutions or medical research. The $10 million, more or less, that I gave for the Washington Monument gets much more attention than $1 billion given to medical research. Why is that? Because so few people are doing it. I've tried to talk to some of the wealthiest people in the country and say, look, I know you're giving lots of money to medical research, that's very good, and education is very good, and scholarship is very good, but why not make a gift to the country and fix this monument, fix this memorial, do something that reminds people of our history and our heritage. I have met with less success than I would like. People just don't seem to think it's appropriate. They say, well, the government's supposed to do that. The government of the United States is operating at a $1.2 trillion annual deficit. It's not going to have the money to fix up some of these memorials or monuments. Take the Lincoln Memorial. Lincoln Memorial was kind of shabby, falling apart a bit. The roof was crumbling a bit and was not in good shape. So I went there and I said, I'll put up the money to fix it. We'll put an underground education facility so people can learn more about Lincoln, and then we'll fix the thing and so forth. And I remember announcing it one day. It was snowing, and I'm sitting there on C-SPAN, and I'm talking with the Park Service. The Park Service ranger head is there, and I'm there, and I'm talking about this gift to fix it up, and it's snowing and really coming down. And so I get a call from my cell phone. Who could be calling now? It's my mother saying, David, put your hat on. It's it's snowing out there, don't you know? Snowing, so I put my hat on. Okay. So, so in philanthropy, I think what you're trying to do is give back to society, thanking people for what's the good causes you've had in. I would say that I recently was reminded of something that some of you may know about, but Alfred Nobel came up with a very clever idea when he died to create the Nobel Prizes. Now, whether he's looking down from heaven and saying, hey, for the amount of money I gave, I got a pretty good gift. It's like John Harvard gave $300 worth of books to Harvard, and he's got this name forever, perpetual giving, and he only had to put up $300 worth of books. So it's a really great gift. And Alfred Nobel put up a fair amount of money, but it's gone on for a long time, and it's a great prize. But what actually happened is, before he died, his younger brother, Ludwig, died. And the Swedish newspapers made a mistake. And they said, Alfred Nobel has died, the merchant of death, the inventor of dynamite. Thank God he's gone. And so Alfred Nobel was reading his own obituary. And he realized that this is how people looked at him, and he wanted to do something about it. And I ask audiences all the time, how would you think your obituary would be written tomorrow? If you, were to die tomorrow, God forbid, and you have an obituary, would it say, this person had great homes, great planes, great artwork, or would it say, this person really helped society and made society better and made his or her neighborhood, community, state, country a slightly better place than when he or she came onto the earth? Now, obviously, the latter is what I think you should want. And I try to encourage people to find something to sink your teeth into it. It can be patriotic in many ways, because we need a lot of supporters in that area, but it can be something else. And I think if people say they don't want to do that, I would tell them to do it for selfish reasons, which is to say this. People who give away money or give away their time, their energy, and help people in patriotic forms or philanthropic forms, they are happier. And happier people live longer. David Rockefeller lived to 102. Grumpy people don't live as long. Now, very few people who give away money or help other people say, you know, I'm really sorry that I helped those kids with that scholarship. That was a waste of my time. I'm really sorry I helped these people get some food that they otherwise didn't have. That doesn't usually happen. Usually people feel good about themselves, and I think you will live longer. And that's my theory. I also have a theory that people who give away money are very good philanthropists, have a special place in heaven reserved for them. Now, you may laugh at that, but why would you want to take a chance that I'm wrong? So I encourage all of you to, think what you can do. And I want to point, some of you are roughly my age, it looks like, maybe younger, a little older in some cases. And I'll tell you about a mistake I made in my own philanthropy that I hope you who can do something about it will do. My parents grew up in Baltimore, and they moved to a suburb of Baltimore when they retired called West Palm Beach, Florida. And they were living down here. And, if you live in Florida, you spend half your time going to doctors. My parents were always going to doctors back and forth, but they seemed to be okay. But then my father suddenly had a heart attack and died, and I didn't anticipate it. And I realized what an idiot I had been and what an ungrateful son I had been, because my father obviously helped raise me. I was his only child, yet I had never done anything to really honor him. Yes, my parents were pleased with what I had done, and I realized that when my mother used to call me up and say, I'm proud you're giving away the money, I adopted what I call the mother test. If your mother calls you up and says she's proud of you, that's the most important thing in life. What could be better than that? But I didn't really do anything to honor my father, so after he died, he was a U.S. Marine. I decided to do something and honor him, and I redid the Iwo Jima Memorial, which is dedicated to U.S. Marines who lost their life in combat. And my mother was there, and I realized, geez, my mother's seen this, but what am I doing to honor her? And so when the Smithsonian, I'm the chair of the Smithsonian, and one of our museums was being redone, I put up the money so I could name a large part of it after my mother, and I took her up from Florida to see it, and she was surprised. She didn't know it was going to happen, has her big name there and so forth. And she was crying and very happy, and I realized that I should have done that much sooner. She died just a few months later. And my point is that you should take your time to think about how you can honor your parents, because it's harder to do that when they're gone. It's easier when they're alive. And I try to tell audiences all the time. Now, many of you may not have your parents alive anymore, but you can still honor them. But if you honor your parents, maybe your children will honor you at some point too, because I'm not sure that's the major focus of my children, which is honoring me. But I just think it's an important thing, and when you're giving back to society, you can do many different things, but I think you shouldn't ignore the parents who made it possible for you to get to be where you are.
You've made a powerful case that giving to patriotic organizations can honor you and honor your parents. Tell us about why the founders thought it was important for the survival of the Republic. We have talked about how Madison believed that in direct democracies, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. And how Madison and Jefferson thought democracy could not survive ignorant and free, and unless citizens educated themselves about the principles of the Constitution, then they would give rise to demagogues. So Adam Meyerson has started up a great new civics education initiative, and I want you to tell him and our friends why it is urgently important for the survival of the Republic that they support civic education.
The founding fathers are more or less religious figures in our country. Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington. These are extraordinary people who helped to create this country. You often wonder, then there were only 3 million Americans then. 500,000 slaves and 2.5 million free people in the time of the Revolutionary War. We now have 330 million Americans. Where are the Jeffersons and Washingtons and Hamiltons and Madisons? I don't know. Maybe they're here, maybe they're in this room. It may be that you have an opportunity and you rise to the occasion. So though we had a very small country then, 1% of the population we have now, we managed to create these incredible figures who gave us a country with the principles of liberty and justice and freedom for all and equal opportunity. And I hope that we are able to perpetuate this for hundreds of additional years. But I think if we don't educate people about the Constitution and how the country works, I think we're going to have a less good democracy. Right now, I believe that most people in this country, without studying, could not pass the test that immigrants have to take to be a citizen. 91% of the people who take the immigrant test for citizenship pass. 91%. Now, they study. Without studying, I dare say that most people, and maybe I couldn't pass it either, couldn't pass this test because we know so little about our Constitution, so little about the history of the country, and so little about the Bill of Rights, for example. Or another good example is 35% of Americans, when asked, what river did George Washington cross during the Revolutionary War, said the Rhine River, which is not even in our country. 30% of Americans asked, who was the first Treasury Secretary, said Larry Summers, which is not the case. 80% of Americans, when asked, when was the Civil War, did not get it right within 20 years either way. So we just don't know very much, and I think there's an obsession with STEM education, which is very good, but I like to remind people that people that are often running the biggest companies in the United States, not that that's the only important thing, they often had humanities or liberal arts backgrounds. They didn't have STEM education. So I think there's an obsession with catching up with the Chinese. You all may remember we had to beat the Russians in the Cold War, and so we did different things, and we did things to change our country's educational system. Now we're trying to beat the Chinese, and in an obsession with doing so, we're ignoring things like history. In today, you can graduate from any college in the United States, any college, without having to take an American history course, with almost no exceptions. You can, in 80% of the colleges, you can graduate as a history major and not have to take an American history course. And needless to say, you can graduate from virtually any junior high school without having to take a civics course. So I just think we need to have more civics education and history education so people will know more about the good and the bad of the country. And my view is we should learn about the good and the bad. We had a birth defect in our country, slavery, and it took us 100+ years to get rid of it, and we still have some of the vestiges of it. But we should know about the good and the bad, and if we don't, we're condemned to relive it. A famous historian at Harvard, George Santayana, once said, those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. And my own view is those who don't preserve history are not going to be able to remember the history that we had.
A question about equality and distribution. A few years ago at the Philanthropy Roundtable, I presented the interactive constitution that our essay appears on, which unites the top liberal and conservative scholars in the country to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. I'm thrilled that the College Board has just agreed to distribute this to all 3 to 5 million AP kids. So when they take an AP class, whether it's biology or Italian, you'll have 2 weeks on the Constitution, the core principles of the First Amendment, and read our essay. But we can't just stop at AP kids. And my question to you, David, and I don't know the answer, and it's also to our friends, is how do we bring constitutional knowledge, not just to AP students, but to underserved kids, to kids across the country, and basically to communities that don't now have access to that kind of education?
Well, it just gets to one of the biggest problems we have in our country. Income inequality is rising in our country. The theory of if a country gets wealthier, everybody should get wealthier, but it doesn't actually happen. In our country right now, we have the greatest economic disparity between the upper income people and the lower income people than we've ever had, ever. And it's getting worse. And why is it getting worse? Well, there are many reasons, and there's no easy answer to fix it. If I knew the easy answer, I'd be running for office, but I don't have the easy answer. But one thing that I worry about relating to your question is this. We don't have people how to read very well. Forget constitutional and civics literacy. They don't know how to read at all. It's hard to believe, but 14% of the adults in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. There are about 10% of the people in this country can't even read to a 4th grade level. They can't read at all. And I don't mean somebody who's born in another country coming here and doesn't do English. I mean in their native language, or if it's English, they can't read at all. So the result of that is 80% of the people who are in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. 2/3 of the people in the federal prison system are functionally illiterate. So if you can't read, you have no chance of really getting a good job, no chance of breaking out of the barrier of poverty. And it's a big problem. We need to make sure that people get educated and stay in school, because my children are going to be well educated and so forth, and your children are going to be well educated, but we have an underclass in this society, and it used to be that people like me would believe in the American dream, and many of you may have believed in it, and maybe many of you are representative of it. You come from nothing and you rise up. Now, many people at the bottom don't believe that's possible, and therefore there's a lack of social mobility. Countries do well when people from the bottom rise up, and it's not when the people from the top stay at the top. It's when people on the bottom rise up. And many people at our bottom of our society now don't think they can rise up, and they've given up. They don't finish school, they don't care about reading, and the result is life in crime and poverty and homelessness. And I think we have to tackle that problem, because if we don't do that, I think we're condemned to a two-class society.
We're out of time. I want to end by you giving our friends inspiration and a call to action. So I want you to tell them why you believe it is important for them to support the teaching of history and patriotic institutions, and why you believe in the American ideal.
Well, obviously, I came from modest circumstances and became the symbol of maybe the American dream. There are many people more symbolic than me, for sure. I do think that if we can get our children, our grandchildren, to learn more about the history of our country, the education, about the Constitution, we'll have a better society, more informed society. The U.S. Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen, for those who don't know, is a brilliant scholar, first in his class at Harvard College, Yale Law School, Supreme Court clerk.
That's not true either.
What?
That's not true either, but keep going.
And George teaching professor at George Washington Law School, and then he was asked a few years ago to head up the U.S. Constitution Center, which was built in Philadelphia, to remind people in a visible way of what the Constitution's all about, the good and the bad. And now he operates that, and it's really does terrific things about educating people about the Constitution, has an interactive Constitution process so people can learn more about it and participate in learning more about the Constitution. I highly recommend it as a place to go to take people to learn more about the Constitution. And I think what all of you should do is think about what you might be able to do to add to your own civics knowledge and your own knowledge of history, but also what you can do to help others learn more about it. Because I think if we don't teach more people about the history of our country and things like the Constitution, we're going to have a very uninformed society and a less desirable society. But thank you all for what you've done already to date.
Thank you so much, David and Jeff, for your truly inspiring conversation. David mentioned that you're really inspired when you see a great historical document in person. So we've been truly inspired to see a great philanthropist in person and a great interviewer. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.